Today I'm going to show you a really simple but effective way to create a modal shift in your playing without necessarily having to think of a new scale pattern. And for the backdrop of this lesson, I'm going to use the jam from Gumbo because it's such a beautiful chord progression and it does have this kind of change in vibe that happens throughout it. So let's get into it. Hey, Chris here. Thank you so much for checking out the lesson. I wanted to share some little simple tricks you can use on Gumbo in particular, but really this could apply to a bunch of different songs that have sort of modal shifts like Free, AC/DC Bag, Sample in a Jar, amongst many other ones probably that I can't think of off the top of my head. At any rate, sometimes I think with modes we can get into a thing where we think of them primarily as scale patterns, which is really great. So this isn't like a rant against scale patterns or anything like that, but the approach I'm going to show is how we can accomplish a really similar thing where we shift things in the modal vibe but use arpeggios instead. So let me give a quick outline of the chords for Gumbo, which are really simple. We're going to have an E flat minor. I think sometimes Trey plays either just a minor chord or a minor 7, and then an A flat 7, although I think again sometimes maybe he just plays like a regular bar chord depending on the mood, and then a D flat 7, and then it just goes back to E flat minor / minor 7. So that's really it in terms of actually most of the song. I think there's one other chord in the entire tune, which is a B flat 7, I think. But that's really it. That's our focus is going to be for the jam right now. So here's what I'm going to propose that you try out for this is a combination of just E flat minor pentatonic, or like the minor blues scale, which is always a great way to kind of glue everything together. And then instead of like playing the 3 chords in arpeggio form, what I'm going to propose instead is that we use the E flat minor pentatonic plus A flat 7 arpeggios and then an A flat minor arpeggio instead of the D flat 7. And the reason for that is if you really think about the tones that are in a D flat 7 chord, they're very similar to what you would find in an A flat minor 7. And I'll show you what I mean here. So I'll just kind of get right into what you can try out with this and kind of war game it as we go. So let's go up to first position of E flat minor pentatonic and use that as like a home base. And then we'll kind of work our way backwards actually. Instead of going up in positions, we'll move backwards. So E flat minor pentatonic, we've got that. If you want to do the blue note in there as well. So here's part of the challenge to try out in your own practice is in that position, can you find where there's an A flat 7 arpeggio? Maybe even stop the video right now and challenge yourself to just kind of look at where you're at. You know, the first step might be just find where is an A flat right over here in this position, like the 11th fret. Pause the video if you want to do that. If not, just keep watching and I'll explain it right now. Here's an A flat. And what I would say is one really cool way you can play an A flat 7 arpeggio is this index finger version of the arpeggio where you go, root note, major third is up on the 15th fret of A, 13th fret of D, 11 of G, 13 of the B string, 11, and then of the high E string, I should say, and then 14. You could also put the root note up on the G string. I didn't do that. Maybe you could throw that in. Kind of like that. So, at first you may want to just get used to that and play over the chord change, just kind of doing some E minor pentatonic. Kind of stuff like that. Just doing the arpeggio just straight up, just playing it up and down and just getting it under the fingers a little bit before really trying to improvise truly and mixing things up. I mentioned that instead of going to a D flat minor 7 chord, which actually is a really cool way to go, I'll get into that a little later depending on how long this takes. But instead of that, I mentioned that it's a lot of the same tones in an A flat minor 7. And one of the advantages there is it's one less thing to kind of juggle mentally. It's a lot easier, I think, just to flatten the third on the arpeggio you were already playing than to think of a brand new one and a new root note and stuff like that. That being said, that is a cool approach, so I'm not saying that isn't cool. But instead of the dominant chord, just do a minor third. Like that, it's the same stuff, just with a minor third. So let me explain that a little better. Here's your A flat. Here is your minor third. There's the 5th, the flat 7. Then if you want to do the root again, minor third, 5th, flat 7. I also think, and I mentioned this a little bit ago, that a really cool sound is doing it as a minor 6 chord instead of a minor 7 chord. So in that case, you would just, instead of playing the 7, just go 1 fret to the left and then plug in all the other stuff the same. And, you know, if you think about the D flat chord, and I don't want to get too into the weeds on music theory stuff, but that's the major third of a D flat chord. And so it really sits nicely over that chord. Let me just play for a second. I've got a loop on deck here, and I'll just show you what I mean. I'm going to start with E flat minor pentatonic. I'm going to switch to an A flat 7 arpeggio, and then to an A flat minor 7 or an A flat minor 6. I'll just kind of vibe out on both of them. So here we go. Hey, I hope you're enjoying the video. We're going to get right back to it in a second. I just wanted to say that if you want to be able to just pick a guitar up and just kind of flow and improvise, but maybe you don't know quite what kind of stuff to work on, or maybe you feel a little stuck in your playing in general, or if you want to really get down your favorite Fish song, you know, start to finish, then you've got to check out my online course and community, Elevated Improv. I've got a couple different options. I've got one for people that just want to do their own thing and work at their own pace. And then another option for people that need a little more guidance. You can do a goal setting session with me, and then there are weekly group sessions with a great group of people that just want to get better and love improvisation and love Fish, and it's a great time. So there's a link in the description. Check it out. Now back to the video. What we're going to do, like I mentioned, is move backwards and go to the 5th position of the minor pentatonic, E flat minor pentatonic. So you could play that down here on the 11th fret of high E. Or actually, let me start at the low E string, and, you know, something like this. And, you know, wouldn't be a bad idea to kind of vibe out on where, you know, where's that blues note. And if we're right here, then it's... If you have a different finger and you prefer or whatever, you know, do your thing. But there's the scale pattern. And then I'm going to give you the same challenge right here. So if we're in this sort of 11th fret area, you know, with the pinky finger now instead of the index, where's the A flat 7 arpeggio in this area? And maybe pause the video and give it a second. You know, one clue, though, to think about is you can use that same fret we started the other one with. So if you're still with me and didn't pause the video, put your pinky on 11 of A this time. That's an A flat. And then think of kind of like a C shape. You know, if you're into caged, you can use that as like the bare bones of it and just put a flat 7 in there. And, you know, this is another cool thing to work into just mentally when you're playing. You know, if you play that just simple arpeggio, go from the 5th up a minor 3rd, and that'll always give you your flat 7 to give you that dominant 7 kind of sound. If you don't want to think in terms of intervals, just go up 3 frets to the right, and you'll get it done like that, and then continue. You'll continue on with the arpeggio. So we've got that form that we can work into the mix. So now what we'll do is turn that into a minor arpeggio just by flattening the 3rd. So think about that first kind of triad form. Here's the major 3rd with the ring finger, assuming you're playing it with the same fingers. Just flatten it to a minor 3rd. And then here's the 2nd arpeggio, or 2nd octave of it. Once you have that foundation, it's really easy to find where the 6 is if you want that sound again. It's kind of like the Dorian sound. Like that, you just go up 2 frets to the right from the 5th of your arpeggio, or your triad, I should say. And then you end up with that. So now what I'm going to do is kind of jam over the same loop. I'm going to play minor pentatonic in this kind of zone, and then switch it over to those 2 arpeggios. So hopefully you can hear that it's a really similar vibe. We just have a different shape we're playing around with, or a couple different shapes. And the cool thing is here, as we progressively go, these different chord shapes, they just kind of alternate between like the G shape, the C shape, like I think of, in Cage they call it an E shape, but I think of it more of an F shape. But at any rate, they really just kind of juggle roles with each other. So we don't have a ton of things to memorize. We just kind of shift where we see things. Speaking of shifting, instead of being in this 5th position, let's move down to 4th position, and you may want to play it, you know, like that. If I go from the low E string, and that's our kind of the glue, you know, for everything. In this area, now this is one that's really fun and maybe a little less obvious in terms of finding the A flat arpeggio. So I'm going to give a little clue here. You know, you could do a root position one right here, definitely, but there's a really cool inversion that Trey uses a lot of times. I know I've mentioned it a ton on the channel. So if you want to pause the video and just challenge yourself to, you know, like look at where we're at right here on the fretboard, where can you find an inversion of an A flat that Trey uses a lot? So if you want, pause it. If not, hang with me and I'll explain it right now. There's this kind of form that Trey does a lot of times where he plays basically a power chord and then he puts the major third, or sometimes the minor third, like in Yamar he does that, but in this case it's got the major third on the low E string. You may be thinking to yourself like, well, okay, what am I going to do with that when improvising? But it actually is a really cool form to keep in your head, not necessarily just to strum it, but you can do all kinds of little fun kind of runs against that shape. I'll show an example in a second. And then similarly, you can just flatten the third and do stuff with that. And there's the minor third instead of the major third. So I'm just going to see it as this inversion. That's basically it's an A flat power chord over the major third, and then an A flat power chord over the minor third. And so you could have some stuff like this. Let's keep it moving and shift down a little more. So instead of 4th position, let's move down to 3rd position, which is really fun. You get this kind of this zone here where, you know, maybe you're going like that and you shift up. For every guitarist, you could probably find you know, a different fingering for it. Sometimes I like to practice it with the middle finger, you know, going like that with minimal shifts. You may want to start with your index like that. You know, all good either way. The main point is like taking this area and then trying to kind of superimpose that A flat arpeggio. So like we've been doing, if you want to do it, challenge yourself to pause the video and then ask yourself in this area, where is an A flat 7 arpeggio? If you're still with me, we've got a really fun form over here. We could either do, like if you want to do a 6-string arpeggio, you could start with your index on A flat here. And you could do it like that, or you could just grab, like a more realistic thing might be to just grab this part of it. And, you know, in the heat of the moment, I think sometimes less is more. And, you know, we don't want to have to juggle a bunch of stuff mentally to keep track of and think of when we're playing. We just want to be able to kind of flow. And I think if you strip things back a little bit, it helps with that. So at any rate, the cool thing is I'm going to focus on this upper structure here. So I'm just going from the 6th fret of the D string and just doing like a regular major try like that. Putting, again, think of the 5th here. Remember we were going up 3 frets to get the flat 7. Then you can put the root up there. And, you know, away you go. And you could have some cool stuff where you play off of the flat 7 here. And now we can really easily turn this into a minor shape by just flattening the 3rd, which is the note that we played on the G string. Instead of the 5th fret, play the 4th fret. And you can, instead of playing the flat 7 like we did just a moment ago, do that 6. And like you can really see it in this zone here. When we played the D flat chord as a bar chord, it literally has like an A flat minor 6 in it. So at any rate, I'm going to use this shape over over the A flat 7, and then I'm going to just make it a minor 6 against the D flat chord, and it'll sound something like this. Okay, now our last position that we have not hit on is the second position of the minor pentatonic. So for E flat minor pentatonic, in this case, you could start with your middle finger here on second fret of low E, and you know, some people may want to do like a shift with the index. I know in in real time, like if I'm really soloing over something, a lot of times I will make that move specifically because it's a lot easier to do a bend that way. Like we've been doing here, we're in this zone. Pause the video if you want to and ask yourself, where is an A flat 7 arpeggio in this area, and an A flat minor 6 if you want to go and kind of add on a little bit. If you're still with me here, think about it like this. If we had this note A flat in the last zone and we played it with our index, now our pinky finger ends up on that same fret, and it's really simple. We can just do like a G shape. First, I'll just do a regular major arpeggio like that, and then think of it like this. Once you get that fifth, remember, go up 3 frets, get your flat 7, and then you just do the second octave. So there's our A flat 7, and now let's turn it into an A flat minor 6 or 7. They both sound really cool. Here is the A flat again. That doesn't change. Instead of the major third here, we flatten the third like that. Here's the major 6. And I'm going to do the same thing up here and go like this. Here's your second octave of it, your minor third. Here's your 5th. Here's the 6 right here. And in fact, that kind of sounded a little like It's Ice. It's got that kind of funky sound. So at any rate, we've got major, dominant 7, and then minor 6, and so you may want to practice jamming over the progression with that kind of stuff in your rotation. But one really important point, I should have mentioned this with the other ones, just like we're trying to identify where are the arpeggios, whether it be the A flat 7 or the A flat minor 6, also keep track of where your root note, for, like the tonic of the key is that we're doing. So we're doing this E flat minor centered kind of thing. So it's probably a good idea to, even in these different pentatonic positions, identify where are the E flats. Because it's not that you always need to resolve to the root of the key or the chord, but it is good to know where it is. So here's an E flat, and here's an E flat. So first fret of the D string, fourth fret of the B string. So now a little jam over that, you might get something like... Yeah, right on. So all of that is really fun to play around with. And in this demonstration, I was, more aiming just to kind of outline where the chords are. Then the next thing is, once you get kind of the elements you want to play around with, I would really then simplify it and maybe restrict yourself to just a few notes of the scale, a few notes of each arpeggio. It'll be much less to juggle and a lot less busy sounding. I can overplay sometimes, so I'm trying to simplify things in my own playing a lot, and it could be something cool to look at. But it is important to see where that entire arpeggio is laying on the fretboard. There's a saying I've said on the channel, I say it all the time to students, it's that all things are in all places at all times, always. And that's what I'm trying to get across here, is just look at, okay, just like all the pentatonic positions are all over the fretboard, so is every chord you could imagine. Every chord you could ever dream up, maybe with a few exceptions using open strings or something, but you can find them all within reason all over the fretboard. So that's really what the crux of this whole thing was. I hope that at least gave you some food for thought, and I hope you got something out of it. If you have any questions about any of this, let me know. Leave a comment below. I appreciate you watching the video and spending your time with me, and I'll see you soon. Thanks.